The man groomed into a weapon by Julian Thorne's own hands now found he was to be discarded, just as Julian planned to bind himself to another. Ethan knelt in the snow, a willing supplicant, and listened as Julian's voice, husky and rough-edged from pleasure, announced his impending marriage. Ethan's head snapped up, his gaze crashing into the amused depths of Julian's eyes. With effortless grace, Julian stepped over Ethan's kneeling form as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient stain on the pristine snow, expressing a quiet hope that Ethan would not disrupt the wedding festivities. Disrupt them. That was precisely the plan. On the day of Julian's wedding, he would receive a gift he would never forget. Years later, Ethan had sought a new life on the harsh western frontier, had even taken another to be his wife. But on his wedding night, when he lifted the bride's veil, he was met with the sight of Julian. The corners of his eyes flushed red. Julian looked up at him, his voice a low, accusatory tremor, questioning how Ethan could possibly dare to stop loving him. The news of the wedding had come while Ethan was on his knees in the falling snow, tending to Julian as if he were a pet. Julian sat perched on the wrought iron balcony railing, his shirt unbuttoned, his throat a pale column against the winter twilight. A ragged sigh escaped him as Ethan's service concluded. His fingers threaded through Ethan's hair, a gesture that was part caress, part ownership, while he spoke of his marriage. Ethan's gaze met the cool amusement in his. Snowflakes melted on Julian's long lashes as he methodically fastened his shirt, hiding the skin that had just trembled under Ethan's touch. He moved past Ethan, his footsteps silent on the snow-dusted stone, his voice a whisper on the wind that was heavy enough to break a man's back. He wished for an undisturbed ceremony. Ethan remained kneeling, the lingering taste of Julian in his mouth mingling with the coppery tang of blood from his own bitten tongue. Undisturbed. Julian knew better. He knew the feral thing he had created lured with calculated warmth, tamed with a maddening cycle of push and pull, and driven to the brink, had no reason left, only a primal instinct to consume. In the formal dining room, the warm glow of the chandeliers did nothing to thaw the frozen atmosphere. The quiet clink of silverware was gratingly loud. Mr. Thorne slammed his fist on the mahogany table, making the crystal glassware tremble. A splash of hot soup from a lurching tureen scalded Ethan's face. The old man called him useless, less valuable than a well-behaved dog. His spit flew as he pointed, berating Ethan for his sullen face and lack of help during the wedding preparations, reminding him that an adopted son was, after all, a disappointment. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the cold, congealed stew in his bowl. The whole Julian's words had torn in his chest, now a cavern for the icy draft of his father's contempt. He was numb to the familiar humiliation. Across the table, Julian ate with placid elegance, his movements slow and deliberate. The cuff of his expensive sleeve hid his mouth, but not the mirth sparkling in his dark eyes. He was laughing, a low, suppressed sound that found its way into Ethan's ear with perfect clarity. It was always his way. He would draw Ethan in with those deceptively innocent eyes, with fleeting touches, with late-night confessions and temptations that made Ethan believe he, too, could grasp at some form of light. Then, with the most casual of gestures, he would shove him off the cliff to shatter below. And Ethan, the consummate fool, knowing it was poison coated in honey, would crawl back every time, a starved beggar, and swallow it whole. His adoptive father's venom was almost comical now. The only one who could ever truly wound him was Julian. Only his careless tenderness and his spectators' laughter. Ethan's hand clenched in his lap, nails digging into his palm. Julian would always be the beautiful, vicious heir who knew precisely how to manipulate the hearts of others, and Ethan was his most secret, most damning testament to that skill. The night was as black as spilled ink, the snow falling tirelessly as if to bury the day's ugliness. After a day spent in a daze, Ethan found himself drawn to Julian's wing of the mansion, his boots crunching in the deep powder. A soft, buttery light glowed from the window, painting a false patch of warmth on the snow-covered ground. The door creaked open under his touch. Julian was seated at his vanity, his back to the door, slowly drawing a silver-backed brush through his curtain of black hair. The tarnished mirror reflected his indistinct profile and Ethan's own frozen figure in the doorway. He didn't stop brushing, didn't even look up, as if Ethan's arrival was an expected eventuality. He merely asked what his brother wanted at such a late hour. Ethan's voice was a dry, rasping thing when he demanded to know why he had agreed to the marriage. Julian finally set the brush down and turned. The candlelight flickered across his sharp, handsome features. His eyes were clear, devoid of their earlier languor. He explained it was a family alliance, a mandate from their father, and asked with feigned innocence what part of that was difficult to understand. A mandate from their father. The phrase soured in Ethan's mouth. He lunged forward, his hands gripping Julian's thin shoulders, demanding that he look him in the eye and admit he felt no reluctance, no lingering attachment to him. He searched Julian's face for any flicker of doubt or pain, but found none. There was only a slight furrow of his brow, a subtle expression of distaste, as if he'd been touched by something unclean. He complained that Ethan was hurting him, his tone laced with a barely concealed impatience. Ethan felt the last of his control snap. He wasn't allowed. The suppressed rage and the terror of losing him for good boiled over. He declared that Julian was his, had always been his. He hauled him from the chair and crushed his lips against the mouth that spoke such cold words. Julian struggled at first, his hands pushing against Ethan's chest, but his feeble resistance quickly crumbled under the desperate assault. A small whimper escaped his throat, and his body went pliant, his arms winding instinctively around Ethan's neck. They stumbled towards the bed, a tangle of limbs and frantic need, shedding clothes as they fell onto the soft duvet. In the silent house, the sounds of their ragged breaths and the soft creak of the bed frame were deafening, a desperate attempt to reaffirm a possession that was about to be severed. In a moment of heated entanglement, when the storm outside and the damned wedding were almost forgotten, the door was kicked open with a thunderous crash. A blast of frigid air and snow swept into the room, making the candle flame dance wildly. Mr. Thorne stood in the doorway, his face a mask of purple rage, a living specter of judgment. Behind him, several household staff members held heavy wooden clubs, their expressions nervous. The old man's eyes, sharp and venomous, fixed on the two of them, tangled together. The air solidified. Then, a roar of pure, unadulterated fury ripped from Mr. Thorne's chest, the sound twisted by his rage. He called Ethan an animal, a thankless viper, and screamed his disgust at the defilement of his son. He was shaking, the finger he pointed at Ethan trembling violently. He ordered his men to drag the worthless creature out and beat him to death. The men hesitated, glancing at each other. Ethan quickly pulled the disheveled blankets over Julian, whose face was now ashen. Julian bit his lip and said nothing, his head bowed. Ethan looked from the apoplectic old man to the silent figure on the bed. He didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened up, a grotesque, defiant smile twisting his lips as he met Mr. Thorne's murderous gaze. He dared him to do it, his voice a raw croak. He asked his father what sort of rumors would fly through the city the next day. The adopted son found dead in the heir's chambers. He questioned if the Thorne family's century-old reputation, along with his precious son's good name, was worth sacrificing to become the city's most lurid scandal. Mr. Thorne was struck speechless, his face cycling through shades of rage until he finally choked out that he wouldn't kill him. But he vowed to have the wedding to Clara Langdon moved up to the day after tomorrow. He wanted Ethan to watch Julian be carried away in splendor, to spend the rest of his life looking but never touching. He promised that once Julian was safely married, he had 1,000 ways to make Ethan's life a living hell. With a final, furious gesture, he stormed away, his unvented rage trailing behind him. The staff dragged Ethan out and administered a cursory beating, But the pain in his body was nothing compared to the agony in his soul. This was not what he wanted. Not this naked hatred and irreparable breach. He just couldn't lose him. He couldn't, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. A quiet voice asked if he was satisfied. Ethan turned slowly. Julian had sat up, his expression unreadable, though a faint redness still lingered at the corners of his eyes. Satisfied with what? Ethan asked, his voice raw. With the threat of a living hell, or with the fact that Julian would be another man's husband in 2 days' time? A brittle, cold smile touched Julian's lips. He pointed out that this chaotic outcome was exactly what Ethan had engineered. A knot of guilt and fury tightened in Ethan's chest. He had lost control, dragged Julian into this mess. But hadn't Julian himself, with his constant games of approach and retreat, pushed him to this cliff edge? He stared at Julian, trying to find a flicker of genuine emotion, and told him not to act so innocent. He had started it. Julian's voice sharpened, cutting him off, asking what exactly he had started. Was it calling him brother, or pulling him back from the brink of despair, or was it something else? He paused, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, a feverish flush coloring his pale cheeks. He said that he had offered sugar, but Ethan had repaid him with poison. He threw back the covers and stood, his bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. His thin sleep clothes outlined his slender frame. He was shivering, from cold or emotion. Ethan couldn't tell. All Ethan could think, pathetically, was that the floor must be freezing. Julian accused him of being a mad dog that had scented blood and refused to let go, of treating him like an object to be possessed, without ever considering his own wishes or the consequences. The accusations were a volley of arrows that left Ethan speechless. He wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't like that he just couldn't live without him. But the words that came out were more jagged blades. He sneered, asking if Julian would even tell the truth if asked. He accused him of using his face, his body, and his ambiguous words to keep Ethan on a leash, of deriving pleasure from watching him unravel. And now that the game had gone too far, he wanted to shift all the blame. Ethan stepped closer, their faces inches apart, his own distorted reflection visible in Julian's wide pupils. He hissed that Julian knew he loved him to the point of insanity, that he reveled in the control. And now he wanted to walk away in a pristine tuxedo to be someone else's perfect husband. He told him to dream on. He grabbed Julian's wrist, the force of his grip making the other man gasp. The day after tomorrow, he snarled, his eyes burning with a desperate, destructive fire. He would see how this wedding could possibly take place. Julian looked back at him, his expression a storm of anger, hurt, and something else Ethan couldn't decipher. He didn't struggle. He let his wrist be held, his voice dropping to a weary, mocking whisper. He asked what Ethan could possibly do. Kill his father? Kill him? The thought, a venomous snake, had long coiled in the dark corners of Ethan's mind, but hearing Julian voice it aloud was a physical blow. He released his grip slightly, avoiding the question, repeating only that he would not let him marry anyone else. A strange, shuddering laugh escaped Julian. Tears finally spilled from his eyes. He said fine in a tone of chilling calm. He told his brother to watch, to see whose teeth were sharper, the mad dogs or the unyielding rules of their world. He pulled his hand back, turned away, and curled up on the bed, wrapping himself in the blankets like a shroud. He ordered Ethan to get out. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the slender, vulnerable line of Julian's neck. His heart felt as though it were being alternately scorched and frozen. There was no going back. Either he destroyed every obstacle and chained Julian to his side, even in mutual hatred, or Julian would marry another, and Ethan would be utterly consumed by his own madness. There was no third option. He could not lose him. On the wedding day, the Thorne mansion was a hive of activity before dawn. White ribbons and floral arrangements were everywhere, the sharp scent of lilies filling the air. In his pocket, Ethan carried a small vial of clear liquid, its coldness a stark contrast to the festive chaos. He noted the absence of Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, who had gone to the Langdon estate the day before to finalize arrangements and were expected back before the ceremony. The timing was perfect. He slipped into a service corridor and found the young staff member he'd paid heavily, the one tasked with bringing Julian a fortifying broth. In the shadows of a stone archway, he emptied the vial into the steaming bowl. He instructed the boy to deliver it, saying it was a gift from his brother, to wish him well on his happy day. The boy, trembling, carried the fateful bowl away. Ethan retreated into the shadows, his heart a dull, heavy drum against his ribs. He knew the charade of celebration was about to be shattered. Less than 20 minutes later, a frantic scream erupted from Julian's wing of the house. The young heir was vomiting blood, had collapsed, and a doctor was needed at once. The cheerful chatter in the main hall died as if a switch had been flipped, then exploded into a much louder cacophony of confusion and panicked whispers. The first part of the plan was a success. Julian could not attend his own wedding. Ethan blended into the panicked crowd, watching the staff run about like headless chickens. He heard them wonder aloud where Mr. and Mrs. Thorne were, that they'd been sent for but hadn't arrived from the Langdons' estate. Then, a new sound of terror, a wail of despair from the main entrance, tolled like a death knell. A man in a chauffeur's uniform, covered in dirt and grime, stumbled into the foyer, his voice ragged with horror. He cried out that there had been an accident. The master and mistress, their car, on the cliff road back to the city. The brakes had failed. It went over the edge. The news landed with the force of a bomb. The entire mansion fell into a stunned, deathly silence, followed by gasps of disbelief. The wedding hall instantly became a funeral parlor. Ethan stood paralyzed, his mind a complete blank. How could it be so coincidental? He had wanted to stop the wedding, he had drugged Julian, but he had never, ever wanted them dead. The Thorne mansion was transformed overnight. The white ribbons were torn down, replaced by stark black crepe. Amid the wailing and confusion, Ethan made his way to Julian's rooms. The effects of the drug were wearing off. Julian was propped up in bed, his face a ghostly white, his eyes vacant as he stared at the black banners fluttering outside his window. Ethan approached cautiously, his voice a dry whisper. Julian turned his head slowly. The eyes that once held constellations of mischief now contained only the cold ash of death and a bone-deep hatred. Julian acknowledged his presence with a soft, icy sigh. Ethan asked how he was feeling, wanting to explain, to tell him the crash was a terrible accident. Julian cut him off, a grimace twisting his lips into a horrifying smile. He asked how Ethan thought he should feel. Grateful that he hadn't died from his brother's loving gesture? Ethan's heart plummeted. He swore the drug was harmless, meant only to mimic a severe illness, that he never meant to hurt him. Julian's laugh was a low, despairing sound. He agreed that Ethan hadn't wanted to hurt him. He just wanted to ruin the wedding to keep him trapped. So he had drugged him, and then, just as he fell ill, his parents had conveniently driven off a cliff. He looked at Ethan, his gaze sharp enough to dissect a soul, and asked if he truly believed in such coincidences. As soon as he was incapacitated, they were dead, leaving Ethan in charge of everything. Ethan desperately denied it, insisting the brakes failing were an accident, that it had nothing to do with him. He reached for Julian's hand. Julian snatched it away as if touched by fire, the sudden movement sending him into a fit of violent coughing. A sick flush rose on his pale cheeks. An accident. He gasped out the words between ragged breaths, tears finally streaming down his face, mingled with pure hatred. He accused Ethan of orchestrating it all, of hating them for forcing the marriage. He accused him of getting rid of Julian first, then his parents, also he could have everything he wanted. Ethan felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making, unable to defend himself. Julian stared at him, demanding to know the truth. Had he put something in his soup? Yes. Did he want to stop the wedding? Yes. Did he hate them? Ethan was silent. Seeing his silence, the last glimmer of light in Julian's eyes died, replaced by an absolute, freezing distance. He vowed that he would never, ever forgive Ethan. Ethan opened his mouth, but any words of explanation felt utterly hollow. He had administered the drug. He had harbored dark intentions. And though his parents' deaths were a tragic coincidence, in Julian's mind, and even in the damning court of his own conscience, it was a sin he could never wash away. At the funeral, Ethan, as the adopted son, wore a simple, dark suit, his face a mask of grief. He stood as the de facto head of the family, accepting condolences with a voice hoarsened by sorrow. He knelt before the caskets, the flames from burning memorial candles flickering across his seemingly devastated face. Whispers of sympathy followed him. People remarked on his strength in the face of such tragedy, noting that in a crisis, he was the one holding the shattered family together. He listened to the praise, a frozen tundra in his heart. The real heir, Julian, was absent. It was widely believed he was too grief-stricken and ill to attend. No one knew he was being held captive in a remote part of the estate. After the funeral, Ethan officially took control of the Thorne family's vast, crumbling empire. Using the business acumen he had quietly absorbed over the years at Julian's side, he moved with ruthless efficiency to stabilize the company, purging rivals and securing assets. No one dared to question the quiet, overlooked adopted son who now held all the power. Late one night, after dealing with a mountain of paperwork, he walked to the secluded suite where Julian was kept. Inside, a single dim lamp burned. Julian sat by a window that had been bolted shut. A hyper-realistic painting of a garden scene hung on the outside. He wore only a thin white silk robe, his dark hair falling around his shoulders, making his face look even more translucent and pale. He stared at the fake window, his gaze empty. He didn't react to the sound of the door opening. Ethan moved behind him, reaching out to touch his shoulder. Julian flinched away violently. His voice was a quiet, firm command to not be touched, colder and more cutting than any scream. Ethan's hand froze mid-air. He finally choked out Julian's name, reminding him that he had been the one to reach out first, the one who made him love him in the first place. He was 24, Julian 18. It was late spring, and the wisteria in the Thorne Gardens was in full, cascading bloom. A few friends from prominent families had come over for afternoon tea beneath the purple canopy. Henry, the affable and handsome son of a senator, was discussing polo tactics with Ethan. Though quiet by nature, Ethan was knowledgeable about strategy and offered a few insights. Henry's face lit up with the pleasure of finding a kindred spirit. Just as Ethan was about to elaborate, a clear, laughing voice interrupted them, asking what was so captivating. It was Julian. He wore a simple, elegant linen shirt the color of a summer sky, looking effortlessly graceful. He slid into the empty seat beside Ethan, his arm brushing against his, and inquired about the conversation. Henry's attention was immediately captured. Julian then casually picked up the glass of iced tea Ethan had been drinking, took a sip, and turned his charming smile on Henry. Professing ignorance about such aggressive sports but expressing a keen interest in learning more. His feigned admiration had Henry eagerly launching into a detailed explanation. Ethan sat silently, watching Henry's rapt gaze fixed on Julian, and the way Julian would occasionally flick a glance at him. A glance that seemed both dependent and strangely provocative. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach, the feeling of something precious being casually claimed by another. The conversation soon revolved entirely around Julian, who deftly steered it from polo to poetry to city gossip, becoming the undisputed center of attention. Ethan was rendered an invisible bystander. Any attempt he made to rejoin the discussion was cleverly intercepted by Julian, who would turn to him with a sweet, almost cloying affection, asking for his opinion, thereby pulling the focus right back to himself. It wasn't an overt snub. Julian would refill his glass, or brush a fallen petal from his knee with a natural intimacy. But this performance of closeness, combined with his subtle theft of all social oxygen, created a bizarre dissonance. It made Ethan feel like a prop, chained to Julian's side to better highlight his own charisma. When the guests left, Henry was still telling Julian he was a delight to be around. As soon as they were alone, the lively atmosphere vanished. Ethan turned to leave, but Julian caught his sleeve. His voice, stripped of its social charm, now held a hint of vulnerability as he asked if Ethan was upset. Ethan didn't turn around. He asked what was wrong. Julian came around to face him, his eyes shimmering as he asked if Ethan disliked him talking to Henry and the others. This close, the clean scent of him was intoxicating. Ethan looked away, denying it. But Julian persisted, lightly tugging his sleeve, asking why he'd been so distant. He leaned closer, his voice low, and confessed that he didn't like seeing Ethan give his attention to Henry and ignore him. The childish complaint was like a feather stroking a raw nerve. Ethan stared at him, and Julian's expression shifted into a knowing, teasing smile. He asked if Ethan had been a little jealous. A hot flush climbed Ethan's neck. He denied it hotly, but Julian moved even closer, his warm breath ghosting against Ethan's ear. He whispered that the way Ethan had been looking at him, it was as if he wanted to hide him away from the world. The blood rushed to Ethan's head. He recoiled as if burned, snapping at Julian to stop talking nonsense. Julian looked genuinely hurt, his head drooping. He mumbled that he was just joking, that he only wanted Ethan to pay more attention to him. The sight of his distress extinguished Ethan's anger, leaving him feeling helpless and flustered. He reached out to comfort him, but Julian leaned into the touch, resting his forehead against Ethan's chest. His warmth seeped through the thin fabric of Ethan's shirt. Ethan's body went rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs. In that moment, he knew with terrifying clarity that the simple lines of their brotherhood had been irrevocably blurred. And Julian, with his calculated innocence and intoxicating words, was weaving a net, and Ethan, seeing the trap, was already powerless to escape. The funeral had barely concluded when the Langdon family arrived. In the grand sitting room, Mr. Langdon sat with a stern expression, his son standing beside him with an air of arrogance. Ethan greeted them respectfully. Mr. Langdon dispensed with pleasantries, getting straight to the point about the now complicated marriage contract. Ethan explained that given Julian's poor health and the family's tragedy, it was not the time to discuss marriage. The younger Langdon scoffed, questioning how long his sister was supposed to wait for an invalid. Mr. Langdon silenced his son, but his own gaze was just as sharp. He reminded Ethan of the Thorne family's precarious financial situation, of the 3 major shipping routes, and the expiring transport contracts that the Langdons controlled. His voice was low, but the pressure was immense. He stated that the marriage contract would proceed as planned. Since Julian was unwell, Ethan, as the new head of the family, would marry his daughter, Clara. The wedding had to be soon to stabilize both their interests. Ethan was stunned, protesting that it was improper. The son laughed, reminding Ethan of his own dubious path to power. It wasn't about propriety, it was about profit. Mr. Langdon's tone softened, but the threat remained. He presented it as the best solution. Ethan marries Clara, she becomes the mistress of the house, and the Langdon family provides its full support. The alternative was left unsaid, a heavy stone of impending ruin. Ethan stood trapped, his mind flashing between Julian's pale face and the wolves at his family's door. Finally, he heard his own voice, thin and strained, agreeing to the marriage. A look of satisfaction crossed Mr. Langdon's face. He declared the wedding would be in 3 days. As he left, he clapped Ethan on the shoulder, commending him for his pragmatism. The wedding was a muted, somber affair, a transaction stripped of all joy. Ethan, numb in his tuxedo, went through the motions. As night fell, he stood in the corridor outside the bridal suite. He sent a message for his new wife to retire without him, then walked to the secluded wing where Julian was kept. Inside, Julian sat by the window, bathed in moonlight. He didn't turn, but a soft, derisive laugh escaped him. He remarked on the irony of Ethan leaving his wedding bed to visit such a sordid place. When he finally faced Ethan, his face was a pale mask in the candlelight. His eyes filled not with tears, but with a chilling, lucid clarity. He mocked him, asking if his new wife was not as entertaining as he, or if Ethan's obsession was so complete he could only find satisfaction with his captive. Ethan had no words, only the desperate need to close the distance. His kiss was a confession of his own twisted devotion, and his tears fell freely. Julian did not resist. He met the embrace with a kind of resigned surrender. But in the depths of their desperate coupling, his voice, hoarse with arousal, whispered poison in Ethan's ear. He pointed out the bitter hypocrisy. Ethan professed a love so deep it drove him to madness. Yet it was another woman who wore the white dress, another woman who held the title of wife, while he was kept here a dirty secret. He asked if it was exciting, more interesting than simple imprisonment. Ethan froze, his body going rigid. Julian's fingers, cold as ice, traced the line of his jaw. He acknowledged that Ethan had locked him up, but he had now married someone else. He vowed that he would hate him, that he would stop loving him. He told Ethan not to cry, that this was only fair. That night was a brutal collision of hatred and despair, two trapped animals tearing at each other with no hope of salvation. When Julian finally fell into an exhausted sleep, tear tracks still wet on his cheeks, Ethan gently covered him. He composed himself and walked to the real bridal suite. His bride, Clara, was sitting on the bed, her veil lifted, her face a portrait of humiliation and fear. Ethan stood at the door, his voice tired. He apologized for the night's events. Her eyes were full of tears, but also a stubborn resignation. He told her plainly that he could not love her, could not offer her a real marriage. But as the mistress of the house, she would want for nothing in terms of status or comfort. All he required was for her to play the part of Mrs. Thorne, to appease her family and maintain appearances. He knew she loved another, and he promised that when the time was right, he would help her leave to be with him. He offered her everything except his love. After a long silence, she lowered her head and whispered that she understood. After the wedding, Julian became terrifyingly quiet. The taunts and barbs ceased, replaced by an empty, hollow silence. To provoke a reaction, any reaction, Ethan grew more cruel. He deliberately smashed Julian's favorite antiques and tore up his cherished books, hoping to ignite even the fire of hatred in his eyes. But Julian remained impassive, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the confines of the room. Business forced Ethan to leave the city for several days. Before he left, he double-checked the locks on Julian's suite and ordered that no one was to go near except to deliver meals. He returned days later, exhausted but successful, and went straight to the suite without even changing his travel-stained clothes. He threw open the door to a scene that stopped his heart. Julian was half-dressed on the bed. His dark hair spread across the pillows, an expression of familiar, languid seduction on his face. His fingers were stroking the back of the young man who delivered his meals, who was leaning over him. The servant saw Ethan and scrambled to his knees, babbling in terror. Julian, however, slowly pulled his robe closed, not even bothering to look back. He merely commented, with a voice husky and nonchalant, that Ethan had returned. Ethan's own voice was a twisted thing as he demanded to know what they were doing. The servant insisted that Julian had seduced him, that they had done nothing. Julian finally turned, a cruel smile on his lips, and asked what it mattered. He reasoned that if Ethan could have his wedding night, why couldn't he have his own pleasures? The last thread of Ethan's sanity snapped. He lunged for the cowering servant, his boot raised to strike. But Julian's sharp cry stopped him. He scrambled from the bed, his robe falling open, and threw himself in front of the servant, shielding him with his own body. He met Ethan's furious gaze without a trace of fear, his voice cold and defiant. He said that if Ethan wanted to beat or kill someone, it should be him. He admitted to seducing the boy, absolving him of all blame. Ethan was shaking with rage. The words tore from his throat. How could he ask him to let the boy go after what they had done? Julian's smile was full of a devastating sadness. He asked if Ethan was going to kill the servant just as he had killed his parents. The accusation ripped through Ethan, who choked out that their deaths had been an accident. He asked, his voice breaking, if Julian would still love him if it weren't for their deaths. Julian's reply was a quiet, soul-destroying whisper. He hated him. He wished he could eat his flesh and drink his blood. But he knew Ethan wouldn't kill him. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with a hopeless mockery. He said that Ethan, his poor mad dog, couldn't live without him. He confessed then that he had never loved him, but he knew Ethan loved him, and he wanted him to feel the agony of seeing something precious defiled. He dared him to do his worst, but to let the boy go. As he spoke, he produced a sharp, gleaming letter opener from his sleeve and pressed the point to his own throat. He swore he would die right there, in front of him. A bead of blood welled up, a stark crimson against his pale skin. Fear, absolute and paralyzing, seized Ethan. He could not lose him. Not like this. He dropped his hands, his voice a shattered wreck as he ordered the terrified servant to get out and never be seen again. The boy scrambled away, leaving them alone. Julian kept the blade to his throat, watching him with the wary eyes of a cornered animal. The fight drained out of Ethan, replaced by a soul-crushing exhaustion. He walked forward and gently took Julian's wrist, prying the blood-stained letter opener from his trembling fingers. He let it clatter to the floor. Then he pulled Julian into a crushing embrace, burying his face in his neck, the scent of another man still clinging to his skin. His voice was a broken sob as he asked why he would do this to him. He whispered that Julian was all he had left, the only thing in his world. Julian did not love him. He had known this for a long time. Once, he had overheard Julian telling a servant that Ethan was just a toy to pass the time, more interesting than a dog. The words had been a plunge into ice water, shattering his fragile hope. But he had loved him, so he endured. Julian, for his part, remained oblivious, still coming to his room on cold nights, still seeking comfort. The early warmth had been real, but the possessive, desperate love that grew from it was a twisted, consuming thing. The sound of the letter opener hitting the floor was the death knell of Ethan's last illusion. He couldn't let him die. He would rather be hated, be tormented, be abandoned, than live in a world without him. He arranged for a quiet annulment with Clara Langdon. He purged the staff of anyone who knew the truth. Then, he methodically transferred the entire Thorne estate, every stock, every property, every dollar, back into Julian's name. With each signature, he felt as if he were carving a piece out of himself. He was relinquishing his last claim, his last reason to keep Julian by his side. He left a letter stating that he was unfit to lead and was heading to the frontier to atone for his sins. In the pre-dawn gray, he rode out of the city alone, without a backward glance. He was leaving Julian with a restored fortune but a shattered soul. He could not love him anymore. The frontier was a harsh, unforgiving place. Ethan joined the army, starting as a grunt, and poured all his pain, regret, and suffocating love into the violence of the battlefield. He fought with a reckless disregard for his own life, seeking an end that never came. He was wounded, scarred, and left for dead multiple times, but always, somehow, survived. He rose through the ranks, a ghost of a man known for his brutal efficiency. He even ran into Henry, the senator's son, now a decorated officer himself, who barely recognized the haunted man Ethan had become. Years passed. News from the city was infrequent. Julian, they said, had proven to be a formidable businessman, restoring the Thorne name to even greater glory. They said he and Clara Langdon, after their ordeal, had reconciled and were now a celebrated, devoted couple. Each piece of news was a fresh stab to Ethan's heart, a pain that eventually dulled into a chronic ache. He told himself it was for the best. Julian was safe, successful, happy, free from the madman who had almost destroyed him. The Emperor, pleased with Ethan's military victories, summoned him back to the capital, bestowing upon him a new title and a grand residence. Ethan accepted the honors but refused any position of real power, preferring the anonymity of his new, quiet life. He tried to be normal. He even agreed to an arranged marriage with the daughter of a fellow general, a woman of good standing. On his wedding day, his new home was filled with guests and noise, but Ethan felt nothing but a cold, dead silence within himself. After the ceremony, he dismissed his attendants and walked alone to the bridal chamber. The bride sat waiting, her face hidden by a traditional red veil. He picked up the ceremonial rod and slowly, mechanically, lifted the fabric. The face revealed beneath was not his bride's. It was Julian, dressed in a magnificent custom-tailored red suit. He looked up, his eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light. He was more beautiful and more dangerous than ever. The ceremonial rod slipped from Ethan's numb fingers and shattered on the floor, just like his carefully constructed new life. Time stopped. He could barely breathe. His voice was a strangled whisper as he asked where the bride was. Julian rose, his red suit a slash of brilliant color against the muted room. He glided towards Ethan, explaining that he had paid the woman off handsomely and arranged for her to disappear. He asked, his voice dripping with venom, if his brother was disappointed. The word brother was a deliberate twist of the knife. Ethan stumbled back, a primal fear seizing him. He told Julian he was insane, that this marriage was decreed by the Emperor himself. Julian laughed, a sound devoid of humor. He said he had learned from the best, from Ethan's own playbook of deception and destruction. He taunted him, asking if he really thought he could start over, marry, and simply forget him. His fingers brushed Ethan's jaw, forcing him to meet his gaze. He told him it was impossible. Ethan shoved his hand away, years of repressed emotion erupting. He demanded to know by what right Julian could dictate his life. They were finished. Julian had hated him, had wanted to die to escape him. Now Ethan had given him what he wanted, had let him go, had tried to become a different man. He screamed, asking why he wouldn't let him go. But Julian's voice turned shrill. He threw Ethan's words back at him, asking why Ethan hadn't let him go when he had dragged him into hell and made him just as twisted as he was. He said there were no clean slates. He grabbed the front of Ethan's wedding jacket, his knuckles white. He told him that love wasn't something to be discarded when it became inconvenient. He hissed that it was too late. From the day Ethan had first yielded to his temptations, they were doomed to torment each other until death. Since Ethan had molded him into this creature, he could never be abandoned. He shoved Ethan back onto the wedding bed and began to unbutton his own red jacket, a self-destructive fury in his eyes. He said this was the only right he needed, the fact that he was here, having sacrificed everything to drag Ethan back into the inferno with him. He leaned down, his lips brushing Ethan's ear, a taunting, pleading whisper, daring him to love him again, like before. Ethan's voice was hollow as he asked what Julian truly wanted. Julian's lips found his throat, a biting, desperate kiss. He wanted to be loved, like before, with an obsessive, all-consuming passion. And if Ethan couldn't give it, he would force it out of him, day after day, year after year, until he was once again nothing but Julian's mad dog. Ethan scrambled away, the memory of Julian pale and dying, the letter opener at his throat, flooding back. The terror of that moment was as fresh as ever. Julian saw the fear and his expression softened into a look of cruel innocence. He reminded Ethan that he hadn't been so timid when he was the one drugging and imprisoning him. The old name was a needle in his heart. Ethan begged him not to call him that. Julian smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. He reached for Ethan's face. Ethan flinched away. Julian's hand dropped, and the warmth in his eyes froze over. He said very quietly that if Ethan wanted to hide, he could try. Ethan hid. He buried himself in his duties, but Julian was inescapable. He began frequenting the city's most fashionable salons, seen laughing and drinking with handsome poets and young officers. At a state banquet, he was openly flirtatious with a visiting prince, their intimacy a flagrant spectacle. Ethan sat at his table, gripping his wine glass so tightly it threatened to shatter, the silent mockery of the other guests burning his skin. He drained his glass and did nothing. He saw the triumphant smile on Julian's face falter for a second before his expression hardened into ice. Then the public displays stopped, replaced by something far more sinister. A series of accidents began to plague Julian. A fall from a horse, a near drowning in the estate's pond. Each incident was more alarming than the last. Ethan knew it was a calculated campaign, each near miss a hammer blow against his own fragile composure. The breaking point came with an urgent report of bandits in the nearby mountains. As Ethan was preparing to lead a squadron to hunt them down, a panicked servant reported that Julian had gone into those very mountains to see the autumn leaves. Reason abandoned him. Without armor, grabbing only his sword, Ethan rode like a man possessed, his horse's hooves beating a frantic rhythm that echoed the terror in his own heart. He found him deep in the woods. Julian's guards were fighting for their lives against a group of vicious attackers. Julian himself stood just outside the fray, watching with a detached, almost amused expression. When he saw Ethan charging towards them, his smile widened, his eyes bright with a terrible, triumphant light. Ethan cut his way through the bandits, a whirlwind of bloody vengeance. When the last one fell, he strode towards Julian, his sword dripping. He demanded to know if he had had his fun. Julian looked up at him, his gaze clear and deep. "Not yet," he said softly. He explained that since Ethan was avoiding him, he had to find a way to make him come. Ethan, his voice tight with rage and fear, asked if he was so eager to die. Julian stepped closer, ignoring the blood on the sword, and touched Ethan's chest. He wanted him to look at him. Then, his voice cracking, he confessed that he knew. He knew the death of his parents was an accident. He admitted he had been playing games, stringing Ethan along, but when the marriage contract was signed, he realized he loved him, that he couldn't marry anyone else. He had orchestrated the scene with his father, hoping to force his hand. He said Ethan's love felt like a cage, and he had lashed out with words of hatred he didn't mean. He explained that the scene with the servant was a lie, a jealous charade to hurt him. He even admitted to finding Clara Langdon's lost love and financing their new life together. After Ethan left, he said he had finally understood. Tears streamed down his face, hot against Ethan's cold skin. No cage, he sobbed, was more terrifying than a world without him. He looked at Ethan, his eyes raw with a desperate, final plea. He asked where he could possibly run to now. The forest was silent. Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them, his gaze was dark with resignation. He dropped his sword. He reached out and pulled Julian into a fierce, bone-crushing embrace. The clean scent of him, mixed with the stench of blood, was a poison he could no longer live without. Julian trembled, then sagged against him, a weary bird finding its nest. In the quiet of the embrace, he nodded. The hunt was over. Or perhaps Ethan realized he had been the prey all along. This time, as they watched the dawn paint the window red, Julian whispered against his skin before falling asleep, telling him not to be afraid. This time, he would walk with him to the end.